Okay, now starting on page 210. He linked his dashed hopes to Bacon's errand to the area of Henry Lake. 4 years later, in Ned's Purse Joseph, Howard wrote that when he had dispatched Bacon back on August 18th, it had been specifically to Tacker Pass, or what is now called Targhee Pass, or Targhee National Park, the gateway the Nez Perces would use to enter the park. It had become evident to my mind, he wrote, that the Nez Perces would go that way. But the lieutenant had arrived too early, Howard went on, and seeing no Indians, and had turned back, thus missing the bands by 2 days. His command's tedious work might have been finished, Howard wrote, if only Bacon could have known. Much later, in 1907, Howard took a much tougher shot at the young officer, who by then was dead and unable to defend himself. He wrote that Bacon had been at Tacker Pass when the bands showed up, but did not have the heart to fight the Indians on account of their number, and so let them go by and pass through the narrow gateway without a shot. If not for Bacon's cowardice, he was saying, the war might have ended right there. This is the most egregious case of Howard's post-war dissembling and self-serving, if only because of its unfairness to a loyal officer. Howard's orders to Bacon surfaced decades later. They show that he had sent Bacon and his 40 men not to Tacker Pass, but to Reynolds Pass, fully 15 miles away. Bacon was to exercise prudence and caution. His orders were not so much to block the Indians' advance, how could he, as to harass them if possible, and above all to tell Howard where they were. His mission, that is, was essentially reconnaissance, not combat. Finally, Bacon was told to send no more than 48 hours in his search and to come straight back if he had not found the bands by then. Bacon obeyed these instructions perfectly and consequently never had a chance to be the coward that Howard would call him. He never saw any Indians because he was sent nowhere near them, and because he left the area when told to after 2 days. That was on August 20th, when the Nez Perces were engaging Norwood's company, and when Howard, after that fight, was choosing not to push ahead only 10 more miles to confront the Nez Perces in their camp. Later, Howard wrote that on learning that the bands had gotten away into the park, he felt, quote, like a poor dog watching the hole from which the badger had just escaped, unquote. But in retrospect, it was Howard, not Bacon, who seemingly, quote, did not have the heart to fight the Indians, unquote. Howard is a dork. Howard reached Henry Lake on August 23rd and ordered an indefinite halt. In 26 days of hard marching since leaving Idaho, his command had traveled about 500 miles. Those who had chased the bands back in Idaho had covered much more than that. 4 days they had lived on rice, coffee, and fried dough. Their writings suggest they were not so much exhausted as thoroughly frustrated and looking longingly over their shoulders. Everyone was sick of the fruitless pursuit of these Indians, Fitzpatrick wrote to his wife, and Wood thought that the command is pretty much, I might insert tired there, but rather homesick, I imagine. There was no doubting the toll on their appearance. Howard's chief of staff called them dirty, ragged, and lousy. Most had not bathed or washed their clothes, or even taken them off, for more than 3 weeks. Wood described himself as artistically and picturesquely ragged, clothed in dignity and a pair of buckskin patched pants out at the knees and fringed at the bottoms, with the wreck of a white slouch on my head and a tattered blouse fluttering on my back. He resembled nothing more than a living scarecrow. The problem was more than sartorial. The next leg of pursuit would take them into high mountain country during a season of rapidly cooling weather. Already their water buckets had a layer of ice each morning. Each man had only one thin blanket, and unless the troops were supplied with overcoats, socks, and more covering, one of Howard's surgeons wrote, they would soon be slowed or stopped by illness and rheumatism. While his men rested, bathed, and laundered their clothes, Howard rode 60 miles to Virginia City, the nearest settlement of any size. I wonder where Virginia City is. To refit his men, he picked the refit his men, he picked the town's outfitters nearly bare and bought more than 200 horses and mules to replace stock lost by attrition and raids. Virginia City also had the nearest telegraph terminus, and Howard wired McDowell and Sherman about his next move. Sherman happened to be nearby at Fort Shaw in west-central Montana. Only a week later, he had been much closer than that. He was spending much of the summer touring western posts, and in early August had decided to see the area's more impressive sights. During August 6th through 17th, Sherman and a small entourage visited the mountains in northwestern Wyoming where the Yellowstone River had its head, a spectacular country of waterfalls, hot springs, and geological oddities. They enjoyed it hugely. They also sat squarely in what was about to be the Nez Perces Path, which raises the war's most intriguing what-if possibility. When Sherman entered the area, there was no hint of trouble there. He took only 4 soldiers. "I do not suppose I run much risk," he wrote. The Nez Perces were far away. Then, as he was seeing the sights out of touch, the Nez Perces were moving south from the Big Hole to the Snake River Plain, and then heading rapidly eastward. Sherman was the Army's commanding general, the nation's highest-ranking officer except for the president. What if the Nez Perces had found him and his party around some campfire sipping whiskey and frying trout? They might have taken him hostage. More likely, they would have killed him just as another soldier. Whatever the outcome, it would have eclipsed by far the hoopla around Custer's defeat. It certainly could have shifted the course of the war. Such a turn was avoided when Colonel Nelson Miles sent a party on a rapid ride from the Tongue River cantonment, and Sherman ran into a few tourists who told him of brewing trouble. He left the area on August 17th. Now, out of harm's way at Fort Shaw, he heard from Howard in Virginia City. Things were at the sticking place, Howard wired. Should he stay the course, or should he turn over the campaign to others across the mountains in Buffalo country? His feelings, to say the least, were divided. He, quote, has changed his plans 3 or 4 times, unquote, Mason wrote. Howard was disposed to press on, disappointed at not reaching a brilliant end. Yet in the previous sentence, Mason told of Howard making arrangements to carry on, quote, unless he can get permission to return, unquote, implying a quite different attitude. Fully 10 days earlier, back at Bannock City, and before the trouble at Camas Meadows, Howard had told officers that unless he caught the Nez Perces in the next day or 2, he would notify McDowell that he was quitting. Now he wired Sherman, I cannot push the command much farther. He had heard that Colonels Nelson Miles and Samuel Sturgis were somewhere ahead of the bands. If they could only head them off, he said, he would give it up and proceeded slowly back to Boise. If he hoped to be taken out of the game, he was disappointed and doubtless humiliated by the response. McDowell replied that Howard was closer to the Nez Perces than anyone else in the Army, and everyone, Sherman, the War Department, the nation, expected him to push ahead aggressively to the very end. Stop worrying about what others might do, McDowell added, in all kindness, and look instead to your own resources and strategies. Sherman agreed. Howard's force should pursue the Nez Perces to the death, lead where they may. Then came what must have stung. If you are tired, give the command to some young energetic officer who could get the job done. Howard was back at Henry Lake when he heard from Sherman. He quickly replied, You misunderstood me. I never flag. It was just such energetic young officers who were fagged out, not himself. And Sherman and McDowell shouldn't fear for the campaign or doubt my pluck and energy. The next day, Sherman wired that he was glad to find you so plucky. Units farther on would stand ready to help, he added, but he inspected that the Nez Perces were lurking somewhere else, probably in the Bighorn Mountains, in hopes that Howard would break it off so they could head to Montana. The next day, the chastised Howard led his men up the trail the Nez Perces had taken 6 days earlier. It took him into Yellowstone National Park. In one sense, it was one more stretch of difficult terrain. In another sense, he was entering another realm.